I think the number one thing to remember with Joseph is that he comes down in that genealogy, in that line from his father, from Israel, and Israel really was Jacob. You know, we just talked about Jacob in the previous lesson, and when Jacob got kind of done, Joseph comes along, and so I'm going to show you the story of Joseph, but it's important to contrast that with where he came from, and you'll see some themes again re-emerge. You know, like we've been talking in the rest of Genesis. It's interesting to me that a lot of the stories just kind of tend to repeat, and you kind of go, well, wow, like these people are all cut from the same cloth, so to speak. So I'm sure you'll pick up on some of that as we get going. So Genesis 37. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Jacob, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. Joseph, beg your pardon, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the land was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah and his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Something to think about here. Remember when Israel or Jacob, when he was growing up, right? You remember his brother, right? His brother was kind of loved more than him. And so now it's kind of interesting, he's got this preference. And then you've also got, you've got him with not loving Leah, but he was loving Rachel. So again, he's just showing partiality, and the brothers are picking up on it. It says, but when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers. And they hated him even more. So, here's the first thing, right? Just because God gives you a dream or a vision, it doesn't mean that you should share it with people straight away. You need to have wisdom. So it says, so he said to them, please hear this dream, which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now you would think at this point he would go, okay, not well received. Didn't really like what I had to say. Cool. I'm gonna keep the rest to myself. But no. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers. And he said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him or jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. In other words, it's not that his father didn't believe him on the dream. He kept it in his mind, but he was saying to him, like, just be careful what you're saying here. And, we all know the story of what goes on. He gets sent to look after his brothers. And then, as this caravan comes past, they're like, well, let's sell him off. And here in verse 25, it says, as they sat down to eat a meal, then they lifted their eyes and they looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites. Now, remember, who are the Ishmaelites? The Ishmaelites came from Ishmael, if you recall, back in Abraham's day, right? So remember, all these people, these different tribes, they diverged, and over generations and generations and generations, they all started to live separately. And so now they come across this company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So it's interesting. You see that, we talked about traders, people being traders, and a lot of the Arabic nations were traders back then. And this shows that they were used to selling people into slavery as part of their business model, so to speak, and with all these other things. But they all came from Ishmael, from that line. It says, so Judah said to his brothers, verse 26, so Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, interesting, something to think about. Remember that Judas sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So there's a bit of a contrast there, right? Someone that was innocent being sold for pieces of silver. It's not the same thing, but it is just an interesting reference point to think about. It says, then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. And he returned to his brothers and said, the land is no more, and where shall I go? So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? So this was the cover-up. And Jacob was very sad. He tore his clothes because he loved Joseph. Genesis 38. And again, like I said, I'm going to skip a bunch of this stuff, but you go back and read it in your own time. But there's some interesting kind of bits that I want to pick out for you and just show you. And this is where, Judah departs from his brothers. He goes off. He takes a wife for his firstborn. And then he's waiting here, the daughter of Shua, this is verse 12, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife died, and Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers in Timnah, and his friend Hira, the Adulamite. And it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's garments, because her husband had died. She covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which was on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him. She was not given to him as a wife. She wanted another husband because her husband had died, and she was told, stay in your father's house and we will give you a husband later on. But she got sick of waiting. You see, again, people in the Bible are looking to take things into their own hands, and they're being impatient. And then you see the results. Okay, so she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place, which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot or a prostitute, because she had covered her face. Back then, their faces were covered so that people didn't know who they were, because they were, it was a shame, obviously, to be a prostitute in those days. And so because of that, they would cover their face. But that didn't seem to bother him. Verse 16, then he turned to her by the way and said, please come in, please let me come into you, let me sleep with you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said to him, what will you give me that you may come into me? In other words, what's the payment for my services? And he said, I will send you a young goat from the flock. They didn't have FPOS back then or checks. So a goat was the trade. And he said, I'll send you a young goat from the flock. So she said, will you give me a pledge till you send it? In other words, okay, I believe you're going to send me the goat, but just in case you don't, how can you prove to me, or can you give me something like a placeholder? It's kind of like a lay-by, right? For those of you that remember lay-by back in the day, for those younger people, afterpay, right? It's the same thing. Then he said, what pledge shall I give you? So she said to him, your signet and cord and your staff that's in your hand. Then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. So she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. So basically, this was proof that he had been with her, because she got his staff and the signet and cord. These were personal items that belonged to a man, and normally a man would not give his staff away, would not give his signet and cord. These were things that it was almost, obviously there's no driver's licenses back then, so this was kind of the equivalent of that. This identified who it was. And then Judah goes back and, because he's an honorable man, obviously not in the case of sleeping with the prostitute, but as far as fulfilling his commitments, he sends one of his guys and says, look, take the goat and give it to the prostitute or to the harlot that was by the roadside. And then everybody looks around and they can't find this woman. And they come back to him and say, look, there's nobody there. And we searched and the people told us there was no prostitute there. And then it comes to pass about 3 months later that Judah was told that Tamar, your daughter-in-law, when it says played the harlot, means she was committing adultery. In other words, she was sleeping around and she got pregnant. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burnt. Now think about this, right? He's sitting there going, oh my goodness, my daughter-in-law, has gone around and slept with people, and now, idiot, now she's pregnant. So, in his righteous indignation, Judah says, bring her out and let her be burnt. And then, she comes out. And so she tells her father-in-law and says, By the man who these belong, in other words, by the man who this staff and signet ring and cord belong, I am with child. And she says to him, please determine who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. In other words, check out the driver's license of the man that slept with me, because he seems so upset that I'm going around acting in this way, and now that I'm pregnant. So Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son. And he never knew her again. In other words, he had to admit that it was his fault. And ultimately, she took it into her own hands. And part of the reason why Judah didn't give her son to Tamar is because the other boy had died, and she was afraid. He was afraid that his son would die. So he kind of just put her aside, and she took matters into her own hands. But you can see again, she goes out and does the wrong thing, and yet God still has a plan. So look at verse 27. Now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. Remember, who else had twins in her womb? And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Because remember, the firstborn had the birthright. Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterwards his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. So it's interesting here. You see that the firstborn was identified with the red thread, and yet he was technically the firstborn, and yet this other one usurped and came over. So you see this kind of sequence of events where God is showing that just because the firstborn is due something doesn't necessarily mean that he can't bless the younger. And you see this all throughout the Bible, and we saw this earlier on as well when we're talking about the blessings between Esau and his brother, and how Esau had the birthright, and yet the blessing was still upon Jacob. And so this is a similar sort of happening. Again, this is why I like to read it this way, is because you start to put the pieces together, and it makes the Bible a lot more interesting when you see that all these characters, all these players, so to speak, they have a sequence of events that they're following. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of the house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had. And watch this, it says that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. In other words, he had such trust in Joseph that he had no idea about any of his possessions. It's like turning over his bank balance, his house, everything over to Joseph. And the only thing that he even knew was the bread that he actually ate. He was like, all right, I'm aware that I own this because I'm eating it. That's it. But look at why the blessing was upon this Egyptian house. The blessing was there because of Joseph's sake, not because of the Egyptian's sake. Why were they blessed? Because of the blessing of Abraham and all of that lineage, because God had spoken to Abraham that all of his descendants will be blessed. It says that Joseph, and I'll kind of skim over this. I know you guys know the story, but Joseph was a good-looking dude, and the master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." I wonder if she tried to be a bit more seductive. This seems kind of plain, but she says, "Lie with me," and he had integrity, and he said, "No, I'm not going to do it." And eventually, you can read. She starts to kind of nag him, starts to go after him, and he will not do it because he's a man of integrity. But eventually she tries to force herself on him, and he flees, but he leaves his coat behind. And, she holds onto his coat. Excuse me a sec. And, a tickle in my throat. And anyway, she holds his coat. When the master comes home, she's like, look, he tried to rape me. And he gets really upset because, he thinks that his wife is telling the truth, which obviously she's not. And then, now he's so angry. So verse 19 says, so it was when the master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So it's amazing. You see, Joseph was blessed anywhere he was. Anywhere he was, Joseph was blessed. And it's really good to see that Joseph had integrity, whether he was, on the mountaintop, so to speak, or in the valley. And so we need to learn from Joseph that we are to have integrity in any situation, no matter how much, we are blessed, or how much God gives us as far as possessions or the positions of authority that he puts us in. We are to treat those things with the right perspective and continue to honor God, because he will bless us even in the midst of all the negative things that may happen to us. God was with him no matter what. And I love the integrity that Joseph shows in this situation. And you see, he doesn't kind of fight it. Obviously he wasn't happy. He did nothing wrong, but he doesn't fight it. He goes into prison and he continues to have integrity. He doesn't sulk about it. He doesn't cry about it. He just says, look, it is what it is. And in prison, he still excels, and God continues to be with him. And we see that in the life of Paul, later on when we'll look in the New Testament. Paul was, beaten and harassed and everything else. And yet Paul continued to have integrity, even in the midst of all of that. So there's a lesson that in there for us, that even when we're being treated poorly, we are still to be a light and to show people that we are different. Okay, let's move on. Now, someone sent me a message saying that I'm dropping out intermittently. If that still continues to happen, please let me know. Just unmute your mic and I'll see what I can do. But, my connection seems fine, but just in case, obviously I'm not aware of it. Then he's in prison, and, he's there with a butler and a baker that were also put into prison because the king of Egypt, was really upset with him. The Pharaoh was angry with the officers, so he sends them into prison. And because of that, Joseph's hanging out with them, and they have some dreams. And Joseph interprets their dreams. Again, I'm not going to read through it. You can read it in your own time. But Joseph interprets these dreams. And basically Joseph's interpretation is that, they're both going to be lifted out of prison soon. And he says to them, but here's the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. So in other words, you're going to die, he says to the baker. But ultimately, whether it's the butler or the baker, it doesn't matter. The words that he speaks to them come true. But it says here in verse 20, this is what I wanted to focus on. It says, now it comes to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, the same way that Joseph had said. And he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to him. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So a couple of things to think about. Number one is Joseph gets sold into slavery, from his perspective at least, not his fault. Now you would say, idiot, stop telling people your dreams. Obviously you're upsetting your brothers, but that did it deserve him to be sold into slavery? I would say no. Okay, but anyway, so Joseph still has a good attitude, goes into the land of Egypt, gets promoted, does an amazing job, right? Earns the trust of the kings of Egypt. Then mistakenly, through really the lies of the wife, he gets thrown into prison, and so now he gets dealt a bad turn, continues to excel in prison. Because of, God's with him, and because he's a man of integrity, that now the jailer is actually the chief jailer, or the warden, now says, you know what, you look after the prison. I trust you. Then he meets this butler and this baker, and he interprets their dreams for them. And he says to them, don't forget me when you get out. And then they forget him. So think about this. You're sitting there in prison and you're doing everything right as far as you're concerned. And at every turn, you get burnt. And you just kind of wonder, man, how did he do it? What was his mindset in this? He obviously must have been trusting in God during this time, because for him to go through all this stuff and yet still have a good attitude, I think is pretty amazing. Because, he's obviously doing everything that he can right. And yet, I mean, everyone just seems to burn him. And then you can see here in 41, chapter 41, the butler is with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him his dream. It says here in verse 9, then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream, and it came to pass just how he interpreted for us. So it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh goes, really? So in other words, you're telling me there's someone in my prison that can interpret this dream that was troubling Pharaoh. And so they bring Joseph up, and Joseph interprets the dream. And the Pharaoh actually had two dreams, but Pharaoh, and again, I'm skipping over it. You can read over it in your own time, and it was really interesting to read it, but I'm just going to hit the highlights. Verse 25, then Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. In other words, you had 2 dreams, but they actually mean the same thing, Pharaoh. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind, the 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise. Now pay attention to this. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. In other words, you're going to have 7 good years, and they're going to be amazing years. There'll just be food everywhere. You guys are going to prosper. It's just going to be great. But the famine is going to be so bad the following 7 years, the people won't even remember. They won't even remember the prosperity before, because that's how bad it's going to be. It says, and the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. And so Pharaoh sees that, that Joseph is a discerning and wise man. He agrees with the interpretation, and he sets Joseph up again, restores him to a position of authority. Verse 42, then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck, and he made him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, watch this, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Can you imagine the power that he gave to Joseph? No man, without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot. In other words, people won't be able to do a single thing unless you say so in all of the land of Egypt. It was amazing. And so you can see the blessings that come upon Joseph because of his integrity. And he had plenty of reasons to get upset, to go off course, to do the wrong thing, because he was wronged. I mean, if you want to talk about someone that's had a hard go of it, Joseph certainly was someone. Now it talks about the wisdom of Joseph, and I want to focus in on some of this stuff because it's important. It says verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now, in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. In other words, he was amassing all of this grain in these years of plenty. Verse 53, I'm skipping over a bit. It says, Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." Here's an interesting thing. Quick parallel. When Jesus is at the wedding in Cana, right? What happens? They come to him and they say to him, they come to him and they say to him, that the wine is finished. And the mother, they talk to Jesus' mother, to Mary, and Mary says to them about Jesus, "Whatever he says to you, do." It's actually a repetition. I know it's not the same thing, but it's interesting, right? That there was total control in this situation. Joseph was entrusted so much by Pharaoh. Think about it. Pharaoh's responsible ultimately. Like, yes, Joseph is kind of second in charge, right? 2IC. But ultimately, the buck stops with Pharaoh. And yet Pharaoh had so much trust in Joseph that he basically says to them, "Whatever Joseph tells you to do, you guys do." And it was the same thing with Mary. Mary basically said to them, "Whatever Jesus tells you to do, do." And so I always just find it interesting where some of these turns of phrase are used, and they're literally word for word what you see later on. It says, "Then the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands." So you see, there's wisdom here for us to think about. We'll just pause for a minute. There's a lot of wisdom here. Joseph could have done what most people did, which is completely squandered all those years of plenty. And many people struggle in their own personal lives because there's years of plenty, and in those years, instead of putting some stuff aside and saving some money or investing it or doing something to help it to grow, oftentimes people will just spend more. I know when I was younger and I'd get a pay rise, what would I do? I'd go and spend the pay rise before I even got it. I'd go and buy a better car or take a nicer holiday or do something else, And the problem is that sometimes it's great, when you get the increase. But when the years of famine come or the years of decrease come, you want to have grain stored up. And so there's some spiritual principles in the story of Joseph, but there's also some practical principles that we have to learn from. And now if you look at what's happening in the world, as far as with Russia and Ukraine, and even in America, people are struggling. The people that in Australia, we've been very blessed because of kind of what's happened to the economy here. And I won't get into all of that. I'm not going to teach on that stuff, but I just want to make the point that there are people in America that are doing it really, really tough right now. And yet, we've had in the last kind of 10 years, especially in the US, it's been a time of incredible prosperity. And unfortunately, a lot of people, instead of using that time to store up some grain for the leaner times, they haven't done that. And now they're really struggling. And so there's a lot of lessons from the Bible that we can draw that are definitely spiritual and character lessons, but there are also some very practical lessons that we can draw. And we can see that, God didn't make grain rain in Egypt. God didn't make manna again, right? Or he didn't do it yet. He did it later on with the Israelites. But my point is, God was able to do that, and yet God didn't. God chose to use the wisdom of the world. They basically saved money or saved grain during the plentiful times so that it would last in the lean times. And so God uses practical things to help us through times of trouble, but Christians sometimes have this mistaken view that, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to wait for God to bless me in the time of famine. And it's like, God's been telling you to save up, and you didn't do anything. And now it's a struggle. And so this is not to be critical of anyone. If you're going through tough times, I'm not criticizing you. I'm not saying you've done anything wrong. But what I am saying is that God uses those times to help us. And this is a great, kind of example of that, where God uses the physical things of the world to teach us some lessons from Joseph's life that we can apply for ourselves. So this is chapter 42, verse 1. It says, "When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, 'Why do you look at one another?' And he said, 'Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die.'" So remember, Jacob is Joseph's father. Obviously, he thinks that Jacob's dead. So all the brothers are sent down to Egypt. Yeah. Now remember, Joseph had 11 brothers, but 10 of them get sent down, but they didn't send Benjamin. because Benjamin was loved by his father, and he said, "Don't send him. We're just going to send the 10." I'm not going to go through reading all of this. Many of you will know the story. If you haven't, go and read it. It's really cool. But basically, they come down to buy grain, and Joseph starts to mess with them a little bit, right? Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him, because now he looks completely different. It's much later on. Last time they saw him, he was kind of a kid. He was 17. Now he's in his 30s. They haven't seen him. Obviously, he's not speaking to them, as brothers. He's speaking to them as someone in high authority. And basically, Joseph accuses them of being spies, and they freak out because they think he's going to kill them. So he kind of plays a little bit, a bit of a game with them, right? Verse 21, it says, then they say one to another, "We are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, distress has come upon us." And Reuben answers to him, saying, "Did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen?" They're now thinking that they're going to be in trouble because Joseph accuses them of being spies. And now they're talking one to another saying, "See, the reason this happened to us is because we sold off Joseph into slavery." And they were speaking their language, right? But they didn't know that Joseph could understand them. So it says, "Do not sin against," this is Reuben. Reuben was upset because he told them, and he said, "Did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us." But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. So he takes the brother and he sends the rest of them back, because basically he wants them to bring Benjamin. And they didn't want to bring Benjamin, or Jacob didn't want Benjamin to go. And now they're saying, you have to bring him. You have to bring him if you want to, if you want to get your brother back and you want to go back with the food. And really all Joseph is doing in some respects is kind of messing with them to see if they have integrity. And frankly, I think people kind of want to paint this as that Joseph is only purely super spiritual, but kind of when you read the kind of the games that he plays with them, you can tell he's testing them. He's trying to see if they've learned their lesson. He's trying to see if they've changed. I believe that he's a man of integrity, but I also believe that he kind of remembers what his brothers did to him. And so again, I know there's a lot to the story. Obviously, we don't have time to read through all of it, so that's why I'm skipping heaps. But he kind of puts the cup, he puts the his king's cup in one of the bags, and then they go and find it, and then he puts the money in their bags that they were used to pay for the grain, and he gives them the money back, and then he claims that they've stolen it and so on, and he kind of goes back and forth through all of this. And it's interesting to read the story and to see what's happened. But then eventually they go through all this stuff, and then they go back and they say, "Hey, we need to send Benjamin." And so they come back, and now they're talking to Israel. They're talking to Jacob, right? And watch what happens. This is so interesting. Verse 11, it says, "And their father Israel said to them, if it must be so," in other words, if you have to do this, then do this. "Take some of the best fruits of the land in your vessels and carry down a present for the man," for Joseph, "a little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double the money in your hand, and take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take your brother also, and arise, go back to the man, and may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved." So interesting. Look what he tells them. He says to them, take these presents to the man. Take these presents to Joseph, because this may soften his heart towards you. Where did we see this before? Do you remember when Esau, right? When I've gone blank now. Who's brothers with Esau? Help me out, Naomi. I've gone blank. Anyway, she's gone blank too.
Jacob.
Jacob. Yeah, Jacob. Yeah, sorry, too many names. So Jacob and Esau. So you remember when Jacob was thank you. I remember when Jacob was going to go and meet Esau. What did he tell his family? He kind of put them into companies, and he sent each of them with gifts ahead, right? So that it may soften Esau's heart. So look what the advice is here. Hey, make sure you take presents so that it may soften. You see, it's the same sort of pattern. You see, same sort of patterns of behavior, right? And he's kind of given up, but he's like, let's see what happens. And then anyway, they come in, they give, they meet with Joseph and everything else. And, it ends up, the story ends up okay. But I just want to point out these patterns that, it's just interesting. Right. And then they go through and they just, they play all these games with the cup and everything else. Again, I'm not going to go through, but you can read this, kind of the backwards and forths in chapter 44 onwards. Judah goes in, he tries to get Benjamin because, the cup is in Benjamin's bag. And, again, all these things, but Joseph is testing them, Joseph is testing them. And he wants to see what they're going to do. So now we're going to go to Genesis 45. After all this had happened, Joseph now goes in for the big reveal, right? It's like the block, the reveal, but Joseph style, right? Chapter 45, verse 1 says, Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those that stood by him, and he cried out, Make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, Please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there'll be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord to all of his house, and a ruler throughout all the lands of Egypt. So interesting. Look at Joseph's perspective. Joseph sees, remember Joseph's dreams were that all these people, that his brothers were going to bow down before him. And that's what happened. His brothers did bow down before him. His brothers did come to him for help. But yet, you see, Joseph's perspective could have been, look, woe is me. Look how hard my life is. Look at how I've been wronged by my brothers, by, my master's wife, by the butler and the baker, by the king, by everyone. I've been wronged so many times. But look at what he thinks. His perspective is verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. So he sees God as being the one that orchestrated all this. And if you understand that, you understand why his perspective was what it was. Instead of his mindset being all about him, Joseph's focus was not on himself. And, Andrew's got this book, Self-Centeredness, the root of all, I think, grief, and it's such a great book because it basically says, you're the problem. If you've got problems, it's because of you. And now I know that things happen. Don't get me wrong. There are circumstances, but the reason why Joseph was able to have a great attitude was because he saw himself as being part of God's plan. And when things went wrong, he took the perspective of, yeah, but this is part of God's plan. Yeah, but this may be so, this may be a negative, but God's going to restore me. And you see that wasn't just a thing that he said, it was a thing that he believed. Because he walked that out. Every time something went wrong, you see, he goes in and he's given more authority. He serves with honor and integrity everywhere he goes, and God continues to promote him because his heart is right. And so it's so important for us as we go through life to understand that God has a plan for us. And just because something goes wrong doesn't mean that we're not even in God's will. And just because something goes wrong doesn't mean that God can't use us. But we have to maintain the right heart and the right attitude. And I believe that that's a really key thing, that Joseph shows us in his life, that his perspective is what leads to the way that he behaves. And it's like if your eye is right, Bible talks about your eye being single or being focused. But if your eye is right, if your perspective is right, if the lenses that you look through are correct, then you will behave right. But most people think it's the opposite way. Behave right and then you'll be right. It's like, no, be right or see correctly, see things in the right perspective, and then you will behave the right way. And so it's so interesting to me that Joseph's uprightness is tied to his vision of himself and him really understanding what his purpose was in life. I think that's an incredible life lesson for us. And, now he gets to reunite with his brothers, and he gets to bless his father and to bless his family the way that he said that he would do. And it talks about, how Jacob comes and, where they settle in Egypt. He gets given the best land and all the rest of it. I won't read into all of that. It's quite long. But, they're blessed. They're blessed to be in there. It says in verse 26, all the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons and wives, was 66 persons in all. So you see, all of that lineage was blessed in Egypt. Because remember, Jacob, Joseph, all of these guys all come from Abraham. So God looked forward into the history. It wasn't history at that stage because it hadn't happened yet. But God looked forward and made sure that his lineage was preserved. Because you see, if Joseph wasn't in Egypt, Jacob and his brothers would have died. Jacob and his kids would have died because there was a famine in all the land. And so the reason why he was there was to preserve that lineage. God was providing for that family and for that lineage, and not just providing enough for them to be able to just kind of squeak by, but provided enough where they were blessed, because now they go into Egypt and they're blessed with being able to bring everybody. They give them the choicest land. You can read this, in your own time, but they give them the choicest land in the land of Ramses, and Pharaoh blesses them, right? And so it's incredible to me that even though, they, kind of sell him into slavery and treat him poorly, God doesn't trash them all and go, well, you know what? Fine. I'm just going to preserve Joseph because he's a good guy, but the rest of you, I'm just going to, get rid of you. God blesses them even in spite of them doing such evil things, because he promised to bless that lineage of Abraham. So again, it's just incredible to me the way that God, is able to preserve his word, irrespective and in spite of people's actions. I just think that's amazing. And again, it's a good learning for us. Then Joseph is governor in Egypt. Verse 13, and this is a very important life lesson. I want you guys to pay attention to this because I think this is really, really key. And I think this is where, there's a bit of a sign of the times right now, I believe, for us, in our present day, that I'd like you to draw some parallels from this, okay? Verse 13, so in chapter 47, verse 13, it says, now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they had bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. In other words, there was no point in having money if you couldn't eat. Then Joseph said, give your livestock. They have no more money. Then Joseph said, give your livestock and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone. Right? When they say the money has failed, the money was, they run out of money. They bought all the food that they could with the money. Now they have no more money, but they're saying we still want to eat. And so when the money failed, or when the money ran out in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us bread. And Joseph said, give your livestock and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle of the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus, he fed them with bread in exchange for all the livestock that year. So think about a couple of things. Back then, obviously, they didn't have bank accounts. They didn't have some of the assets that we have today. But the assets of a person, obviously, they had money for transaction, but people's assets were in their livestock. Their livestock is like, investment properties, And so when you buy an investment property and then you take out the equity and buy another one later on, that was kind of like buying cows or sheep or what have you. And then they have, calves or, ewes or whatever it is the animal is, and they have their kids, right? And then that's the next investment property, right? And then you keep feeding it, you negatively gear your livestock, and then hopefully it grows over time, and then you buy another one and so on. And so their wealth was in this livestock, but they just went, you know what good is there having an investment property if I can't eat? And so now they're trading their livestock for food. Then verse 18 says, when that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, We will not hide from my Lord that our money is gone. My Lord also has our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt and to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their lands. Then Joseph said to the people, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your household, and as food for your little ones. Very interesting passage here. This shows you the difference between those that were wise and those that were not. And I believe that there is a lot of application here for our day and age, because you can see that the world is changing. There's a lot happening in the financial world. There's a lot happening as far as security, obviously with Russia and Ukraine and everything else going on. There's China is a rising power, and you're starting to see all these shifts to kind of the global order, so to speak, of how things have been done really since the end of World War II. And you can see here that there were years of plenty. The years of plenty weren't just for Joseph. The years of plenty were for everyone. But Joseph was the only one that actually had the wisdom and the foresight to store for himself some provisions. And look to the extent that where it went. It got to the point where they ran out of money, then they sold their livestock, and now they sold their land and even themselves, because they had nothing left, because they stored up nothing. And Christians, this is an American thing. I don't know how big this is in Australia. You guys can tell me during the Q&A if this is an Australian thing. But Americans have this thing where they talk, the Bible does talk about that the wealth of the world, or the wealth of the righteous, of the wicked, is stored up for the righteous. And there's going to be this big transfer of wealth from the wicked into the righteous. And the Bible says that obviously we're to believe it, but I don't believe that it happens in the way that many of the Christians, kind of the happy clappy Christians would like to believe, which is that God is just going to bulldoze, the wicked, and then just, take their money and shower it onto the believers. I believe that there are opportunities that come up in the same way that they came up for Joseph, that the wisdom of the Christians can then use, or the Christians can use that wisdom of God, like from this story of Joseph, at these times. Because there'll be times of upheaval in financial markets. There'll be times of upheaval in the property market, in the stock market. There'll be assets that are going to go on sale because other people, when they should have been storing up reserves for themselves, they didn't. And they're going to get to a point where it's going to be so difficult for them even just to feed themselves, they're going to be giving things away for cents on the dollar. And it's at that point that if the Christians are wise, they'll be able to take advantage of that situation, not take advantage of people, but take advantage of that situation. And in fact, if you look, yes, Joseph benefited and Pharaoh benefited immensely from what happened, because he got financially richer because he was able to buy everything. But he was actually a blessing because he was able to help them. Imagine if Joseph didn't have any grain. Okay, great. These people would have held on to their assets, so to speak, but they would have died. So what help would it have been to them for them to have died with their livestock and with their land? This way, Joseph benefited, but so did the Egyptians, and because he was able to help them out. And so I believe that, there will be a day, and I'm not predicting anything, of dates and times, but there will be a time, because just financially, there's a cycle when things will go on sale. Property will be on sale. The assets will be on sale, and there'll be an opportunity for a transfer of wealth from the wicked to the righteous, but it won't be because God is supernaturally showering the righteous with stolen money, because God doesn't do that. But I believe that God will give us wisdom and will use the principles in his word for us to be able to store up the grain, so to speak, during the time of plenty. So when the time of famine comes, we'll be able to not just to claim what is ours in the sense of biblically, but also to be a blessing to those people and get them out of a hard situation. because we are blessed to be a blessing. So when you read these stories, think about the practical application in your life, not just the story in Joseph's life, and always be reading and be understanding the signs of the time. And you can see here that Joseph was able to benefit because of his foresight, because he was able to do some things that other people didn't do. And when the time came, that made all the difference for the people of Israel, for his family, and also for the land of Egypt. Couple more minutes and we're going to wrap up. This gets really interesting here. Again, to just compare and contrast what we've read in the previous couple of lessons. It says, chapter 48, verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, indeed, your father is sick. And he took with him 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And Israel, Jacob, strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, this is him talking, explaining what was said, what God said to him. Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. And now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon. They shall be mine. Your offspring, whom you beget after them, shall be yours. They will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. But as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, who are these? Joseph said to his father, they are my sons, whom God has given me in this place. And he said to them, please bring them to me, and I will bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. Where have we heard this before? We've got a blessing. We've got a son bringing their kids to be blessed, and the eyes are dim. When have we seen this before? Right? It says, then Joseph brought them near to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has also shown me your offspring. So Joseph brings the kids, says Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. Now remember, the right hand was considered the good hand in that culture, and which meant that you would touch the one that you would bless the most with the right hand. So he says here, then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, he blesses him. And then verse 17, he says, now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. In other words, he's like, why are you doing this wrong? This is not how you do blessing. You're supposed to bless the firstborn. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. In other words, I know what I'm doing. He shall also become a great people, and he shall also be great. But truly, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that they sang, by Israel you will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Again, that principle of the firstborn not getting what he deserves, the younger superseding the older, the New Testament superseding the Old Testament, the Gentiles superseding the Jews in the sense of, receiving Jesus. And you just see this pattern over and over and over again, that God uses the things of this world that we don't value in the right way, so to speak. And he establishes that he's going to bless in spite of what we think should happen. And so this, it's so funny to me that, Jacob is doing this knowing that he went through the same thing with Esau, and he's being very deliberate about who he's blessing. I wonder why he went through and did this. I wonder if it's because, he had the same kind of experience, the same way that, with this in his own life. and that this was kind of a way for him to kind of establish a precedent that he felt should happen. So it's always interesting to me why when we read it this way, because they become real characters. If you just read a passage here and there, and today you're in this verse, and next week you're in that verse, and then this chapter and whatever, it's really hard. But when you start to read your Bible this way, you go, wow, like, so these people were connected to those people, and then those people had this experience, and then you see the way they live their own life, and it's like, man, that's so amazing. I never saw it that way. 2 more chapters and we'll wrap up. But I thought this was interesting just to call up. Right? And it says, Joseph calls his sons to him and says, gather together that I might tell you what shall befall you in the last day. So Jacob called his sons. So remember, Jacob was called Israel. His name was changed to Israel. And then he has 12 kids, and those are the 12 tribes. And he goes through and blesses them and tells them what's going to happen to all of them. I'm not going to read this. You can read this in your own time. But it says, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them. And he blessed each of them according to his own blessings. And then he says to them, then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. In other words, I'm going to die. Bury me with my fathers in the cave. This is him reminding them of what had happened previously, what Abraham had done. If you remember, when Abraham bought the burial plots, it says, I'm to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron, the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron, the Hittite, as a possession for a burial place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last, and he was gathered to his people. So you see, this is where he establishes, hey, by the way, where I want you to bury me is this place. And here's the history of that place. You know, he's rehashing to them. And so the Bible just keeps establishing that these are real places with real people. Because he didn't just say, bury me in this place, but he's explaining why, and he's explaining how it came to be that they owned that place, and even where they bought it from and from who, and who else is buried there. Then it says, Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm him. You know, and then they talk about, what Joseph does and so on. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. You can read that in your own time. But Joseph dwells in the land of Egypt. He's there with his children, and Joseph says to his brothers, I'm dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So again, you see, he's referencing Abraham. He's referencing God's plan because he recognizes that he's not going to be there anymore, and he wants them to carry God's plan forward. Verse 25, then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him. He was put in a coffin in Egypt. So you can see that man's life expectancy has really kind of dwindled at this point. You're talking about people, living 900, 800, 700, 600 years. And by this stage, people are living to that 100, 120, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And, obviously it continues to go down. So it's just interesting to me that Joseph lives this incredible life. I mean, he's got such integrity. He does things the right way. He's got the right heart. And even though negative things happen to him at every turn, he maintains his perspective. He doesn't lose his focus on God. He keeps his eyes on the prize. And he ends up being a savior to his brothers and to his family. He ends up being a savior to the people of Egypt and the people around with the grain. And then he also ensures the preservation of God's blessing through that lineage, because if it wasn't for him, his brothers and his family wouldn't have made it. And so it's incredible to me, just the integrity of Joseph that we can learn from, and the wisdom that God gave him. But all of that came from him having the right heart and the right perspective. And even though he had plenty of opportunities to be offended, he didn't take them, and that made all the difference. So I hope you enjoyed that. It's just a great story. I recommend you go through and read it in your own time. It's really cool to kind of see all the ins and outs. We didn't have time to go through all of it, but Joseph is one of those characters that we can learn a lot from.